Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. I'd like to discuss my latest beach read, Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, a surrealist novel published in the early 2000s and one that I was reading with my great friends over at the Codex Cantina, who I'm sure are going to have their own awesome video coming out shortly, and when they do I'll put it in the description notes below. But let's talk about this book. So it's Surrealist. It's one of Murakami's larger books, so he's got a lot of ideas he wants to explore in it. He, of course, wants to explore human consciousness in his surrealist books and sort of human existence and memory. But Kafka on the Shore, the title, refers to a couple of things. It refers to a work of art that exists within the book. It refers to a hit single, of which we get a sampling of lyrics. And then I think it refers in part to a character who has dubbed himself Kafka. And this question of, if we think of dreams as like this ocean, and his mind is sort of on the shore, drifting out into that ocean of dreams each night. And so there's a couple of meanings. Apparently the title rights to Oedipus and the Bardo were already taken, because that might have been a more appropriate title for this book. We'll talk about that later. So this is, it's one of Murakami's larger novels, and he just seems to want to build this stew and throw as much as he can into it. So we have surrealism, we have questions around human memory and human fate, really. This question around do the choices our parents made and events that occur very, very early in our childhood, before we have a way to really perceive what's happening and reflect on how that perception, how it's affecting us, do those sort of imprint on us and determine the choices we will make, determine our future. And those are sort of the more weighty themes Murakami wants to ask. But of course, he's got so much more going on. He has his pop culture references, music. There's a very, very, very funny reference to U.S. pop culture and fast food that's hilarious. There is as with many Murakami novels, there's sort of a parallel narrative going on. So he has the one that is, in almost all his books, he has one that's an I novel. So the great tradition of the Japanese I novel that he then takes and tries to tinker with and do something interesting with. And then there's a parallel narrative that's doing something else. And very rarely do they perfectly line up. Usually there's this slight difference that allows for some irony to exist. But there's so much more in this. There's this incredible scene at the end that really seems to be almost type a dream existence or a limbo. There's sections of the book that feel like a hard-boiled thriller, a crime novel, of which Murakami wrote a couple that were sort of, pseudo-parodies of crime novels, existentialist detective books. So we have that going on. We have all this stewing together. And in my reading, I think Murakami lets the stew go too long. And, we talk about books that are less than the sum of their parts. I think many of the parts in this stew maybe burned a little bit, because the book ultimately felt unfulfilling. It wanted to probe these questions, but while Murakami was trying to do best what he does best, he was also doing worst what he does worst. There is, of course, some horrible sex scenes, like truly horrible. It's just stuff that, it's like, where does this end so that I can get to the next part of the narrative? It wasn't even thinly veiled. It was like a bare response to the questions that have been raised around, I think, Murakami and some of the ways he writes about women and the way men view women, the way his male characters view women. That was maybe the part of the stew that burned the most, even though it was just a few pages. And so there are parts of this that are really interesting, and I was really interested in exploring and discussing. But there are also parts where it was just, I was cringing. I was like, okay, when do we move on? Is this something that is going to be dealt with and responded to, or is it just going to sort of be left there to, for whatever purpose, and now Murakami's diverting our attention elsewhere? And too often it was the latter. It was something where it's like, this happened, okay, now let's go over here. And so I wanted to enjoy so many aspects of this book, but the other pieces just dropped. And so I want to give an example of what worked well. Oshima asks the occasional question and files away the details in his head, but he doesn't voice any opinions. I have no idea how that blood got all over me, or whose blood it could be. It's a complete blank, I tell him. He goes on. I really get the feeling that I did, referring to killing somebody. Like you said, I was in Takamatsu that day. I definitely didn't go to Tokyo. But in dreams begin responsibilities, right? Oshima nods. Yates. So maybe I murdered him through a dream, I say. Maybe I went through some special dream circuit or something and killed him. To you, that might feel like the truth, but nobody's going to grill you about your poetic responsibilities, certainly not the police. Nobody can be in two places at once. It's a scientific fact. Einstein and all that, and the law accepts that principle. But I'm not talking about science or law here. What you're talking about, Kafka, Oshima says, is just a theory, a bold surrealistic theory to be sure, but one that belongs in a science fiction novel. Of course it's just a theory. I know that. I don't think anybody else is going to believe such a stupid thing. But my father always used to say that without counter evidence to refute a theory, science would never progress. A theory is a battlefield in your head. That was his pet phrase. And right now, I can't think of any evidence to counter my hypothesis. Oshima is silent, and I can't think of anything else to say. Anyway, Oshima finally says, that's why you ran away to Shikoku, to escape your father's curse. I nod and point to the folded up newspaper, but it looks like there's no escape. And he goes on, and the final line of that chapter is, that's the night I see a ghost. So it's eerie, it can be interesting. And yet, as that's happening, we also have just other passages that either feel like, almost like word vomit, where it's just like, here, let me talk about something that is totally non-germane. Something that Murakami avoids in his short stories, or passages that really get into, matters that we're going to discuss here. So, if you don't want spoilers, stop and jump to the recommended if you like. So some quick spoilers. This book is obsessed with the Oedipus myth to a degree that is disconcerting. Of course, the Oedipus myth is very well known. He's cursed to murder his father and marry his mother and actually have children with his mother. When he finds that out in the Sophocles telling, he is grief-stricken. His mother/wife hangs herself, and he uses her hairpins to stab out his eyes. Pre-Sophocles, that may not have been how things ended for Oedipus. He might have died heroically in battle. But Murakami is obsessed with the Oedipus myth, and we have a character who is obsessed with that, and who believes his father has cursed him to become a postmodern Oedipus, if you will. That's why I made the Oedipus and the Bardo reference. And he is then seeking out both his mother, and he wants to seek out a sister he believes he has, and is terrified / also titillated with the idea of a relationship with her, a sexual relationship. So we have a scene in which there is a dream rape, but we also have scenes in which there appears to be non-dream molestation of a teen going on between an older woman and a 15-year-old boy. Not something I'm interested in, and not something that Murakami really seems to want to examine in any way. These things occur, but the way Murakami does it, the book is almost fascinated by it, not horrified by it. And I think that was the reaction I was having as I was reading the book. I don't know what reaction others have. But that ultimately those were the two parts that really were salient qualities of why the book was less than the sum of its part. The other would be this scene where a character, like in graphic detail, vivisects some animals, and it's very gruesome, and he's torturing them, and it goes on for longer than it needs to for us to have got the point. And so those were the aspects of the book that really just rang so hollowly that the House of Cards was kind of collapsing in the surrealism. But there are books that it reminded me of, and many, many, many. Explicitly, of course, would have been Oedipus. I was thinking of Sophocles, but there's so much of the Oedipus myth and the way Freud approached it that deal much more with the older myth, not so much Oedipus himself. Intriguingly, there's a there's of course the three stages of man in the riddle of the Sphinx that Oedipus solves. And here we have a 15-year-old boy, a young man, Hoshino, who's escorting an older man, Mr. Nakata. And so we sort of have our three stages of man: boy, man, adult man, and old man. Nakata's a fascinating character who reminded me in a lot of ways of the character Charlie in Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Hegel comes in for some references. The Hansel and Gretel fairy tale comes in for references. Henri Bergson comes in for references. So Murakami has plenty he wants to reference, but ultimately the book is just kind of sagging. Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World, I think, is a book I prefer in terms of the way it manages to achieve some closure and explains what's going on in terms of the surrealism, and answers enough of our questions to let us feel that we know where to go on the path with the remaining questions. As I mentioned, he has also written some pseudo-detective novels, including Wild Sheep Chase, Dance, Dance, Dance. Another book that deals with sort of that question around scandal would be, or it's titled Scandal, by Shusaku Endo. A play, I was, of course, Oedipus, we all know what that myth deals with, but the play from John Ford, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, deals with the question of like sibling incest that Kafka is so intrigued by in Kafka on the Shore. Franz Kafka comes in for a mention. I was reminded as well of some of Philip K. Dick's books, the way that he wants to just play with time, play with our perceptions, and then Time Zero by Martin Amis as well. But the other two pop culture pieces I wanted to reference, one would be that there is a moment, if you've ever seen Mulholland Drive by David Lynch, a fellow surrealist, there's a moment where a cowboy character pops up that is terrifying / hysterical. And there is a moment across a couple of chapters in Kafka on the Shore that totally reminded me of that. And the other would be that the references to the single, Kafka on the Shore, had me thinking of the great Japanese city pop music. Light in the Attic Records has a couple of, I believe 2 albums now, of songs from that era. So I'll try to link one in the description notes. But this was Kafka on the Shore. I certainly am grateful to be back on dry land after that book, and excited for what I'll be reading next. Hope everybody has a great week.